How did it feel for you all those years ago, being a pioneer in the movement, one of the pioneers?
Just felt like something I had to do. I was tired of watching my people lose.
Why were they losing?
Because they didn't know how to market. They didn't know how to take the idea of open source software to the mainstream and make it persuasive to business people, to the press, to the mainstream culture. And it was about time somebody took that on.
Why do you so believe in the free and open software movement?
Because I've learned from experience over the last quarter century that keeping secrets is a bad idea when you're developing software. Software that's kept secret doesn't get sufficient peer review, it doesn't get sufficient scrutiny, and bugs lurk in it forever.
When did you first encounter this problem of people closing their source and not allowing other people to contribute?
Oh, it's been in place for my entire career. I mean, when I started as a programmer in 1976 or so, there was already a fairly serious problem with proprietary software. At the time, though, nobody really understood that the secrecy was to blame. Even Richard Stallman hadn't figured that out yet. He wouldn't figure that out for another 5 years or so.
Talking about Richard Stallman, we spoke to Richard Stallman about this, and I want to find out, what are your feelings between the term open source versus free?
Well, I proposed the term open source originally because in 1997 I observed that the term free software had bad karma. If you said free software to a business person or your typical technology journalist, the connotations were not good. They would think of communism and bad things like that.
And so where'd you go from there? You realized they didn't like that term. How has it affected the open source world?
Well, what I decided we needed was I hate these marketing terms, but they're the only ones that are appropriate. What we needed to do was rebrand the product. It's ugly for technical people to have to think this way, but unfortunately, most of the world doesn't run on rationality and good technical decisions. It runs on what kind of image you can present, what kind of sizzle you can put on the steak. So I decided we needed better sizzle for our steak.
For a large part of its lifespan, open source has been pretty much destined for people who are very understanding about computers. How has open source, this marketing term, been to reach the end user market?
I don't know that it has reached the end user market a lot yet. What I was after in my original strategy was to capture the Fortune 500 first. And the reason for that is because that's where the largest concentrated chunk of money is. If you look at the demand pattern that is exerted on software producers, the home and small business market, the end user market, is huge, but it's diffuse. It's very difficult to address that with one product or one strategy. So although in an absolute sense there's more money where the end user is, and the end user ought to have a stronger influence on how software producers choose to license their products, in practice the largest concentrated demand is from the Fortune 500, so I set out to change the demand of the Fortune 500 first.
It seems to me that we've spoken to a lot of people on the show, and you have the most marketing sense with regards to open source. Why haven't many others adopted that approach when it comes to that?
I think a lot of people have. I think a lot of the community has figured out that this is important, but they figure that as long as people like me are doing the job, they don't have to worry about it.
Do you ever feel that proprietary software will ever be eradicated or become second to open source?
I don't think it'll ever be eradicated. One of the things I've discussed in my papers, notably the third one, the Magic Cauldron, is that there are some limited circumstances in which closed source software makes economic sense. And those circumstances are never going to entirely go away. But I think we will arrive at a situation, a market equilibrium, where most software is open source.
When do you think that will happen?
I don't know. If I were good at predicting time frames, I'd be really wealthy, and I'm not. So
let's go on to Netscape. You were instrumental in getting Netscape to release their source code. Can you just tell us a bit more about that story?
Sure. It came as quite a shock at the time. I remember I was sitting at my machine hacking on something, and I got email from somebody who I'd never heard from before, and actually I don't think I've heard from them since. And he said, he pointed me at a web page, which was a Netscape press release, and he said, "I think you ought to read this because they mention your name." And I went and read it, and they indeed did mention my name. And in fact, the whole press release read like somebody had taken my Cathedral and Bazaar paper and sort of run it through the marketee's meat grinder. And so I wrote him back email saying this does look like somebody's been reading my papers, and I guess I should call Netscape and find out what's going on. And I did. And I fought my way through about 15 minutes of voicemail hell, finally reached a human being, and said, "Hi there. Would somebody please tell me what's going on? Did I have something to do with this?" And I got a call back about 20 minutes later from a very nice woman named Roseanne Semino, who doesn't work there anymore. And she said, "Yeah, you had something to do with this. Our top guys read your paper, and they loved it." And I'm going, "Ugh." And, I think our CEO wants to talk to you. And I said, "I think I want to talk to him, too." So I realized at that point that unless I dodged really quickly, and fame was about to land on me, and I wasn't sure I was ready for that. I had to think a lot about whether I was willing to take that on, because I knew that she said that the CEO had been briefing the national press about their new strategy of openness and had attributed to my work, and that meant the press was going to come calling. And I had to think a lot about whether I wanted to take that on or duck back into a hole. I decided to take it on, and that's why I'm talking to you today.
Talking about that paper, The Cathedral and the Bazaar, tell us more about that and how you came about writing it and what exactly was its essence.
Oh, well, okay. All right, the basic thing that I noticed in that paper is that there had been a sort of folk practice evolving for many years in the culture of Internet hackers, and that folk practice was to solve programming problems collaboratively by passing around the source code of programs, not keeping anything secret. In fact, doing the opposite of secrecy, instituting a peer review process, a process of unlimited third-party scrutiny, very similar, in fact, to what scientists do with scientific experiments and engineers do with blueprints. And what I noticed in that paper was this works really well. It works really well for eliminating bugs from software. And furthermore, I noticed that the Linux community seems to be a social machine that was designed to maximize the amount of peer review that Linux got. And I concluded that this probably accounted for the fact that the Linux community was breaking all of the normal rules of software engineering by having a very large, dispersed, disconnected community and very little in the way of central planning, but producing high-quality software anyway. You see, according to traditional software engineering, you're not supposed to be able to do that. According to traditional software engineering, if you're going to produce something that doesn't have a lot of bugs in it, the project group needs to be small, tightly focused, rigidly controlled. Now, that's not a very good description of the Linux community. And yet, somehow, they were breaking all the traditional rules and producing an amazingly high-quality operating system. And I zeroed in on this peer review phenomenon as the explanation.
Eric, could you elaborate a little bit more on the term the cathedral and the bazaar?
I was thinking of actually an illustration in the Mythical Man Month. This is a famous book by Fred Brooks on software engineering. And in that book, he compared large program systems to cathedrals. And it was Brooks who really advocated small, tightly focused teams working in splendid isolation to build these cathedrals. And I wanted to set, and that metaphor has a lot of connotations of sort of central control, hierarchy, organizational rigidity, all of the things that you associate with the kinds of organizations that build cathedrals. And I wanted to set against that some kind of metaphor that was horizontal, superficially chaotic, but in a fundamental and deep sense, self-organizing. I realized I wanted a marketplace metaphor, and to sort of increase the rhetorical distance between that and the cathedral, I decided to make it exotic, from a different culture. So the cathedral versus the bazaar.
Eric, you're reputed to be a proud wearer of the label hacker. Tell us about your life as a hacker.
Well, I became involved with the hacker culture in about 1976, and since you say your audience is newbies, I should explain that anybody who tells you that a hacker is somebody who breaks into computers is talking through their hat. This is nonsense. It's a myth propagated by lazy and ignorant journalists. True hackers are programming enthusiasts. They are people who love to build and improve software systems, and true hackers are the culture that gave you the internet and the World Wide Web. And I became involved in that culture in, I guess, around 1976, when it wasn't even the internet yet. It was the old ARPANET. I continued to be part of that culture and write code and share code and communicate with people and solve problems. I've been in it for more than 25 years now.
But in your opinion, why has Hollywood glamorized the term hacker as being negative?
Do we really need to go into the amount of animal excrement that comes out of Hollywood?
Let's talk about Mozilla and Firefox. After Netscape, they started coming into the market. Can you take us through that, what happened there?
The Mozilla crew actually, as it turns out, took about 2 years to actually get their act together and issue something that was really good. And this was not entirely their fault. They had a huge legacy code base to clean up. A lot of it was very grotty. And eventually, they got something out there that was usable and fairly good. But some people, there was another group of people, I'm not clear on their actual identities, who decided that the Mozilla, while it was okay, was too big, too bulky, too bloated, had too much stuff folded into it. They decided it needed an even more total rewrite to really slim it down and make it simple. And that's where the Firefox effort came from. And one of the indices of the health of the open source method is that the mainline Mozilla project looked at Firefox, realized that this was actually a better approach than the one they were taking, and adopted it.
Obviously, you know that we're here in South Africa.
You know, I've been to South Africa.
Oh, really?
Yes, I visited there once. I gave talks in, I think it was Durban and Cape Town, and the way things worked out, I was able to walk into a user group meeting and say, truthfully, this is a great country for open source software. Where else in the world can you go and see a GNU and a penguin in the same day?
Well, Eric, that was where I'm leading to. With regards to the developing world, how do you see open software being involved in that?
There are a lot of reasons that countries in the developing world are adopting Linux. I understand South Africa is, in fact, one of them. Very mundanely, there's the cost issue. A lot of countries simply don't have the wealth level to afford expensive software licenses for a lot of people. So the low-cost aspect of open source is important. But there's something which is fundamental for a lot more countries. I don't know if this is a big issue in South Africa, but I know that it is all over Asia, for example, and in Europe. There's a national sovereignty issue. People want, especially where the mainline language isn't English or is in an orthography that's not commonly well supported by, say, Microsoft products, people want cultural autonomy. They want sovereignty. They want to know that they have good localizations of software that is under their control. And with closed source software, you can't get that, because whether you get a decent localization is up to the vendor, and they may well decide that your local market is not large enough to support that. On the other hand, with open source, you can do that work yourself locally with local experts, contribute it back to the code base, and it will get folded in. I think I read recently about a project in Southern Africa, I don't know if it's in South Africa itself, to localize Linux into 3 of the native languages. And that sort of thing could never happen with conventional closed source software, because the community for those 3 languages is, I think about 3 million people in total, and that simply isn't a large enough market to interest Microsoft or Computer Associates or any of the other big proprietary vendors. So the surface issue is cost, But the more important fundamental issue is cultural autonomy and national sovereignty, and that's something that a lot of developing countries take very seriously.
Interesting that you say that. Recently, a distro has opened up in South Africa, calling itself Ubuntu, distributing Linux.
Yes, I've heard about that.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Then please, may I have some of your comments about Ubuntu?
It's wonderful that you have a properly localized distribution, and things like this are happening all over the world. One of the more interesting cases is Korea. Perfect example of a market that's too small for major closed-source vendors to address, but they have fierce national pride there, and they want to be able to run their open office with Korean localization. They want Linux with Korean help messages, and they're doing it. They're taking it into their own hands, and they're creating that.
Do you feel that free and open source software is a panacea? Is it scalable in any way?
Nothing is a panacea. Open source is a way to solve a specific and important class of technical problems, but it isn't going to bring about world peace or end hunger or anything like that. As for the scalability question, I'm always amused when I get that one, because one of the things that we're seeing out there is that it's closed source that doesn't scale. The reason that open source is being the big success that it is, I mean, all the marketing in the world couldn't make the method work if it didn't address an actual felt need. And the felt need is the fact that as the average project size of software goes up, as the average line count of software goes up, the bug load is increasing as the square of the line count, because most bugs are unplanned interactions between different parts of a program. And what's happening out there is all of the traditional quality assurance and debugging methods, other than open source peer review, are running out of steam, are failing to scale. So I don't know if open source scales yet in some absolute sense, but what we are seeing is that it's scaling better than closed source production.
Well, in response to that, enterprises seem to prefer architectures like SAP. How would you respond to that?
Actually, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because point-of-sale retail is one of the industry verticals where we've had the best penetration, at least here in the United States. In fact, if I had to list the top three, I'd say it was computer graphics and animation, financial services, and point-of-sale retail. So we're getting plenty of acceptance here. One recent story is, I think that I recall that the Ascendant hotel chain is going Linux for all of its remote operations, all of its hotel-based point-of-sale and database stuff. So I think we're seeing a lot of uptake there.
Do you have any advice for South African open source pioneers?
I'm going to repeat a hoary old cliche: think globally, act locally. Yeah, you are part of a worldwide movement, but your success, when it comes, will come as a result of successfully adapting to local conditions, noticing what the problems are that you can help solve right in your neighborhood, right in your country, next door, down the street, in the same city as you are.
What would you like to see of Linux in the future?
Oh, well, world domination, of course. That's always been the sinister master plan. Blah, ha, ha.
What is the future of desktop Linux?
That's an interesting question. I think what we're going to see, individual end users picking it up last. I think that the near-term future of desktop Linux is probably in large-scale corporate adoptions by large and medium-sized corporations that are looking to cut their IT costs. That's something that's beginning to happen now.
What's your role in the future of Linux?
Probably continually running around and making trouble.
What kind of trouble?
Well, I talk to the press a lot. I get quoted in places like the Wall Street Journal and The Economist. That's a fairly normal thing. So I run around being an ambassador for our community to the press and the business world. I write a lot of code. I'm working on a couple of projects right now. One of my most recent ones was I rewrote most of a service daemon for handling GPSs. That's getting fairly wide distribution now. I'm working on the X documentation. I'm converting that to modern formats so that it can be webbed. And I I just revived a classic computer game from the 1970s that I think is historically kind of interesting called Super Star Trek. I'm going to publish that shortly. And I got a couple other things on the fire. I'll keep writing code. I'll keep talking to the Fortune 500 in the press, and I'll keep making trouble.
Well, I am going to get you perhaps more into trouble, but I'd like to know your opinion on the SCO case.
Oh, what a bunch of carpetbaggers and thieves. Isn't it great that they're so incompetent? I got to tell you, I love SCO. They're such serviceable villains. I think we're going to get a favorable court ruling on the GPL out of this. I think we're getting wonderful publicity out of this. It's great stuff.
What do you think of the conspiracy theory that Microsoft is behind this SCO case?
Oh, obviously they funded the entire lawsuit. I don't think they were behind the original filing of the lawsuit. I think that was homegrown idiocy. That was SCO itself. But I think Microsoft opportunistically is funding this lawsuit as a way to make trouble for Linux, and that's great. I love to see Microsoft throw its money down rat holes.
I apologize. I'm just composing myself. Has anyone told you you're really, really interesting?
Oh.
What is the ideal? What does world domination really look like?
World domination is a situation in which every single computer user in the world has total control of the hardware and the software they own. There's nothing that's hidden from them, nothing that's locked out. They're totally empowered. Open standards, open computing, and open software and open communications everywhere.
Is there any message you'd like to send to South Africans with regards to them adopting open source?
What have you got to lose? You have everything to gain. You have better software, lower cost, more autonomy, more control over your own destiny. You have everything to gain.
Well, Eric, I must say thank you very much. It's been incredibly educating for us here, and thank you very much.
You're welcome.